This is the African Tech Roundup podcast, and I'm Andile Masuku. Welcome back to our special two-part mini-series on digital transformation impacting healthcare delivery across Africa. The series was recorded at the iFHP Big Ideas Workshop 2024 in Johannesburg, South Africa, and these conversations capture the energy and innovation shaping the continent's digital future. Now, in this second episode, we're exploring the digital infrastructure needed to drive the sort of innovation we all hope to see on the continent. Our guest is Victor Mapunga. He is a serial entrepreneur from Zimbabwe whose ventures span blockchain, fintech, and digital infrastructure. In what proves to be a masterclass in startup thinking, Victor challenges conventional wisdom about African innovation, revealing why founders aren't the heroes we make them out to be, and how his latest venture aims to solve one of the continent's most fundamental challenges: reliable internet connectivity in rural areas. Now, what he shares about failure, resilience, and the reality of raising venture capital in Africa might surprise you. That's all coming up, but first, this mini-series is made possible through the support of the International Federation of Health Plans, the iFHP. Now, the iFHP brings together health insurance leaders from across the globe to share insights and drive innovation in healthcare financing and delivery. Learn more about how the iFHP is helping shape the future of health insurance at ifhp.com. This podcast series is an independent African Tech Roundup production. While the series is made possible through the support of the iFHP, the views expressed by me as your host and those of our guests are entirely our own and don't necessarily reflect the opinions of our presenting sponsor. And now, on to the conversation with Victor.
How do you explain what you do to your family in Mutare, a town in the Eastern Highlands of Zimbabwe, where your mother lives, your brother lives, I believe?
That's a good question, because if you had asked my mom what I do, she will also tell you that she doesn't fully understand. But they know that I'm at the intersection of technology and the broader economic system. So the way I explain my work to most people is I'm a technology practitioner, meaning that I use technology to solve some of the problems we have in society. So the institutions which allow me to do this are the startups that I then create and found. Whether it's in fintech, it's in blockchain, it's in connectivity, I work with technology to be able to solve the problems that people experience on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, if you are to ask my mom, what does Victor do? She'll tell you he uses technology to do something.
And so some of the more attentive members of our community, of the village that follow our work and contribute to insights on our platform will tell you that a lot of our work is concerned with exploring the intersection of the emerging digital economy and the quote unquote real economy. And there are a lot of oversimplifications projected onto that space. My interest in you editorially is you are a fascinating specimen of an innovator in that space, not just articulating views on the space and how to improve things, white papering, as it were, but building in that space. So speaking first as the young kid who grew up in Mutare, what are some of the oversimplifications you find most annoying that kind of proliferate that space and thinking about and building for that space?
Yeah, I mean, the first one, I did a presentation in Rwanda last year called, Founders Are Not the Heroes. So in our space, you find that there is a narrative that we as the founders of these companies have some kind of superpower that we possess. When in reality, what makes the things we do very possible, is a lot of background individuals, people, processes that come into play. What we merely do is, we are just organizers of a lot of factors which already exist. So whether that's technology, whether that's talent that we bring into the company, whether that's investors who then bring the capital that allows us to achieve some of the goals we have, whether that's policymakers who then make some of the things possible. The oversimplification is often that you have kind of this mad genius somewhere in a garage who comes up with a crazy idea and, it's worth $1 billion. The reality is much more boring and mundane. In fact, if you were to ask any founder, really, if they could recommend being a founder to somebody else, they'll tell you no, because it's a long, arduous journey just to get things done. The other aspect I would say, which is a bit irking, is really that people often feel like technology is the means to the end, that technology itself will solve the problem. Technology is just a tool, right? If you want to dig the ground for gold, then you can use a shovel, right? Or if, the bedrock is much difficult, you need to use bigger, better machinery, you need some caterpillars. Technology is just the same. It's a tool. Right. The goal you're trying to accomplish is far much more important. And one of the most humbling things is realizing that sometimes the technology does not actually do a good job of solving the problem. At times, there are much simpler ways to get that objective or that outcome that you prefer. And unfortunately, tech startups and the environment we live in has become a bit gimmicky. So you find there's often a use of buzzwords, whether that's AI, blockchain, fintech, financial inclusion, or to raise capital at the end of the day, and trying to then use the tool to solve a problem, when it's supposed to be the reverse, right? Where you identify the problem and the best solution for it. So I'll say those are some of the key critical things that are annoying about it, or some of the oversimplifications that could be much better articulated and much better exposed as to the reality behind them.
That's a great segue to your personal story, your innovation story around your first startup, which I'd love for you to share as a primer for the business itself and the traction it's so far enjoyed and the impact it's having in the world.
Yeah, so my first startup is called FlexID, and really it materialized from an organic experience I had when I moved back to Zimbabwe about 6 years ago.
Where were you living before?
Yeah, so I was in the US. So I was doing various academic programs in the US and in the UK. And I decided, I wanted to go home, apply some of the knowledge I had acquired to be able to solve problems, right? So I had that Pan-Africanist naivete of, let's go back home, let's create companies, let's solve problems. It's also one of the benefits of youthful ignorance, because you do have the benefit of doubt, right? So I had that, and I decided.
And how long ago would this be, and how old were you?
Man, I was young. Most people.
He's dodging the question.
Most people get surprised when I tell them how old I am.
Actually has it as a party trick. Guess my age. So I'm trying to get him to give me money.
Yeah. So I was 21, and I moved back to Zim, and I had this idea. I said, all right, I want to solve problems, but I didn't know what I was going to do. So it was a big risk as well. And, like any other person who moves back to their home country or to a new country, I decided to set up my life, right? And one of the things you do is you open a bank account like an adult. So I decided to visit one of the local bank branches and apply. Now, in my mind, I thought this exercise was a 30-minute, 45-minute, maybe an hour exercise at most. And, I was completely gobsmacked when, I realized that I'm going to need more than a week for this bank application process to go through. I simply could not fill out the form and give them all the information they wanted at the same time. So initially I thought, perhaps this is incompetence on part of the institution, on part of the bank. So let me go to another bank and maybe they might be better. So I went to bank number 2. Same problem. Bank number 3, same problem. Bank number 4, and eventually it became a little bit of an exercise. I said, I want to see what's going on. And one of the most fascinating things was realizing that the application forms themselves. All you had to do was replace the logos. Everything else was the same. Every requirement was the same. And these were regulatory requirements by the central bank in order for them to fulfill what they call KYC, or Know Your Customer, and AML, which is anti-money laundering laws. Unfortunately, in most parts of Africa, a lot of individuals just do not have enough and sufficient identification requirements. I'll give you a good example. They want you to give them a pay slip. Zimbabwe is 90% informalized. Most people are unemployed. I was not employed. All right. I was self-employed. So who was going to issue this payslip? They want proof of residence. Again, home ownership is low. Most people live with their parents. Most people are sharing. They cannot actually produce those pieces of documentation. And a lot of these requirements stem from colonial laws, that would actually leave out most of the indigenous population. And then I realized, something better must be done about this. So I started thinking, and one of the key things I realized was some of the information they wanted about me already existed, right? So I had a SIM card with my local telco. They had my information. I had a mobile money account. They had my information. I had a life policy, which was set up by my family. They had my information. So I thought to myself, wouldn't it be much easier if one institution, which already has done this work, could merely share some of the information I'm being required because they're a trusted authority, they're a trusted institution. And that's how the idea of FlexID materialized. And the solution itself, in a nutshell, is you can think of it as a digital wallet, which keeps and stores all your credentials, from your KYC information to your medical records, to your academic records, to your transactional history. And it allows third parties to verify that information securely and in a fast manner. So instead of filling in forms, you're clicking a button and, that form is automatically filled or populated. And you do not have to go through the process I had to go through, or the process that hundreds of millions of Africans still have to go through when they want to access financial services.
There's this really cool feeling I got when I got my new Zimbabwean passport. They're biometric and they look beautiful. But also, if you're a permanent resident of any other country, the passport is swiped and they can tell without you needing to produce documentation from that country, which was basically my entire life every time I traveled. And what I find so compelling about what you do and what you've built in this platform is not just the convenience element of having effectively all the most important documentation linked to my professional and personal life in one place, but also empowering me with the agency to command a fee for anyone who wants to draw on it in order to serve me a product, and also a mechanism, I should add, to reward anybody who has gone to the effort of acquiring this information legally, obviously, to share it with third parties and creating an ecosystem for those exchanges. So how would you have come to that idea as something not just worthy of creating a business on, because I think it's compelling from an impact perspective, but or a use case perspective, but to build a commercial model on? How would you have iterated it sufficiently to satisfy yourself that you could actually build a business on this?
So obviously the problem itself is massive. And when you're building a startup, one of the hardest things that you're going to encounter is reconciling the product, which is the solution of the technology, to the commercial demands of it being investable, right? Which becomes your business model or your revenue model. You can have the most brilliant idea, or you can develop one of the greatest algorithms ever. But if it does not yield some sort of commercial value, it will never see the light of day. So an exercise for any founder when they're actually going through this process is they have to make sure that beyond it having impact, beyond being usable, it must be fundable. So for it to be fundable, you then have to think about the unit economics around the problem you're solving and how to extract value, and also how to then create value, right? So the difference between a tech startup and, let's say, your normal mom and pop business, right, or an SME, is that most SMEs, they capture value from a market, meaning that, let's say you buy a bar of soap for $1 and you go and you resell it in a place where there isn't enough supply for $1.50, right? You have essentially extracted value from that market. But a startup creates value. And the major difference is
a good one.
Yeah, a good startup creates value.
Caveat's important.
Yeah. And the difference is, instead of buying a bar of soap and selling it, you can buy a bar of soap and say, hey, if I take this bar of soap and I'm able to put it in this machine, maybe that you've invented, it's able to create, 3 other products, right? And what you've done is you've taken one input and you've been able to generate, using a process, multiple other outputs, which are going to yield their own economic value, different from what initially was intended. So obviously with what I was doing was, we were taking the input, which is, being able to get data, right, about an individual, and saying who actually needs this data but can't get it right now. And the how is the software that we create, right? It's the product. And the output, which is the value creation, is what the data is then used for. So whether it's being used for opening an account, giving you insurance, being able to secure a place at a university, being able to verify your medical records, or numerous other use cases that we've not thought of right now, which somebody else might think about in the future, that is value creation. So when obviously you then speak to would-be funders and investors, I mean, this is the most important thing to communicate, right? To say the product in its current form today might not make money. Most tech companies do not. But once we have been able to accomplish A, B, C, D use cases, the unit economics of that looks like this. And really what that requires is scale, which is how do you get the most amount of people or institutions, if you're a B2B business like we are, how do you get the most amount of institutions to be able to use your product? Because once you have a critical mass of utility, value naturally materializes, right? There is no value if no one uses your product. Right? So if no one uses your toothpaste, there's no value. You got to make a product that somebody else is willing to buy and willing to spend money on. And that is how the product itself can be iterated further and further.
This is turning into a masterclass on startup pre.
Yeah.
And it's unintended, but I think it's really brilliant because again, you inhabit this really interesting space at the intersection of digital economy and real economy. And the reason I caveated like a good startup, when you were talking about it earlier, is because you're also in a space that is reputationally beleaguered by, folks who are extractive in nature. So the blockchain space is headlined by crypto and extraction and not value creation. And VC as an industry at its worst is all about extracting value, whether or not true business value or commercial value or even impact has been achieved or not, and a system that seems to enable that, obviously at its worst. And I wouldn't want to paint everyone in VC with that brush, but that's if it's a spectrum, that's at the really negative end of the spectrum. And so you've managed to somehow straddle all of these realities and build something that's both compelling, venture capital backable, and also, relevant in markets like Southeast Asia and parts of South America, and also, I suppose, get the unit economics to work. There has to be an iteration story.
I mean, the first thing I would like to say is in regards to VCs, they probably have one of the hardest jobs in the world. And that is to be able to be masters of capital allocation. Now, there are many other industries where capital allocation is critical, private equity, investment banking, numerous other ventures where you have to allocate capital. But VC is different and special, especially early stage VC, because really you are dealing with limited information, right? And you are using capital for the most part to validate a theory. A theory in this case being a question that somebody has asked about a market to say, if we build this product, will somebody use it? If we solve this problem, would there be value? The founder is trying to convince you that yes, there's going to be extraordinary value. Your LPs, which are the individuals who gave you money, basically saying you have to make a good judgment. Whenever you make a good judgment, we all make high returns. When you make a bad judgment, we lose money. So this individual is playing a very delicate sport. Everybody in the equation is playing a delicate sport, but the VC, what they end up doing for the most part is they end up spreading their capital allocation across numerous companies, maybe based on a certain, category that they want. So for example, they might say, oh, we just invest in climate change companies, right? So they are finding the most promising climate change founders. And in most cases, they run into grifters, which is why the failure rate in VC is about 90%. So meaning that, one in 10 are only going to become a success. 9 out of 10 are a complete failure. And that money is gone. You got to write it off. So that's terrible because, really for the most part, it's very possible that you can lose all your money. The whole fund can just evaporate. So as a founder, you also have to be cognizant of that, right? To kind of answer the question, because you can't really then do it alone. It takes a combination of a good founder and a good VC and a big enough problem or market to address. Without one of those, it's never going to work, right? So, I mean, to tell you a very personal story, FlexID, it was and remains a very difficult venture to get funding for, particularly because we're trying to fit into a very narrow path that does not yield value almost immediately, right? Because one, you are trying to introduce a completely new radical technology to an institution that is lethargic. Two, you are trying to educate a consumer on the value that they are able to get.
So what's the institution in this instance?
The institution in this case can be a bank. It's a healthcare company. It's a university. It's a government. It's your Ministry of Home Affairs. It is any institution with large enough data about individuals that they're able to create digital identity around that, right? Because that's what we're doing. We're creating digital identity products. So there is need to build ecosystems. So you've got the startup, you've got the institution, you've got the VC, and then you've got the market itself to say, is the market itself ready for such a product? Right? Sometimes you can be ahead of your time. A good example I like giving is the Concorde, right? The Concorde, a supersonic jet that in the 20th century was way ahead of its time. I mean, you were doing New York to London, in extremely record time. Unfortunately, because of the economics at the time and the changes in narrative around aviation, it was seen as unprofitable, expensive, and, highly polluting. So they shelved it. And then, travel time has not really improved with planes. We have big planes, but they're not that fast. But now you have a resurgence in interest in investing in supersonic air travel. Why? Because we are now okay with it. Enough people are flying on commercial aviation that we realize that we needed to be faster. We're tired of spending so much time in airports. The technology has been better. It's better emissions now. So now it can be redone. So unfortunately, this is true for multiple industries, AI, blockchain and crypto being a critical one of them. I think crypto is the most revolutionary technology we've had in finance. Probably since the invention of money itself, right? Because this is a reinvention of money. We're talking about programmable money, right? Crypto allows use cases that were not conceivable hundreds of years ago. They were not conceivable even 10 years ago. But because of regulation and because of the lethargy around regulators, especially central banks and even existing incumbents, the banks themselves, there was pushback. And whenever you have pushback, you create a room, an opportunity for arbitrageurs, in this case, speculators. So the number one use case of crypto and blockchain has been speculating, right? This is why you see people say, I've never seen a good use case for blockchain. But the underlying technology itself is revolutionary. So you want to be able to convince your customers, your market, investors, your employees that this is worthwhile to pursue. That is how it's then possible to have some kind of offtake, how it's possible to have some kind of traction. Without that, it's never going to happen, right? It's going to remain a white paper or a pipe dream.
So what do you point to then as the most significant inflection points in your business and or the traction that makes it a going concern in terms of selling this proposition? Hey, VC people, we're deserving of a look in. We're the 1 in 9 potentially. And even if we're not, you'd be crazy not to sort of want to grow or at least ensure that you've done your best to explore what we're doing here.
Look, I think that's one of the fallacies that there is an answer to that kind of question. It just doesn't exist. In the end, I believe that if I communicate my message to you, whether you are a potential client, a potential partner, a potential investor, it is up to you to take the message I've communicated and decide whether or not it's worth your time. That's simply it. There isn't a magic answer or bullet to this. You are going to get people who tell you no. You're going to get people who tell you yes. You're going to get people who tell you maybe. You're going to get people who tell you, come back later, right? So you're going to get numerous responses from the market. You're going to get numerous responses from investors. There is absolutely nothing special I can do, which any other founder, can also do, which has not been done already. right? The reality is it's going to take people with vision to see the value, but it's also going to take people who see the value in you as the founder to be on that journey, right? So whether they are employees, partners, investors, it comes back to you and whether or not the message that you're portraying is believable. Otherwise, there is no secret formula around how to do this. It just does. I wish there was, because then I would have been able to find it by now and it would be easy. I'll be like, oh, this is how you get $1 billion. Unfortunately, it just does. It's not real.
So, I do like your resistance into sort of being wooed into pitch mode, because, and that wasn't the intent, but listening to you, I can definitely appreciate the truisms that you're sharing.
I've been pitching for so long that at some point in time, you realize that it's not the pitch anymore in regards to how to make things work. It's no longer about the pitch. It's about the quality of interactions you're having. So you gotta have much better interactions and conversations that yield results. You can pitch. I've pitched over 500 VCs in my life. And out of 500 VCs, I think I've only raised money from less than 5. So that is 5 out of 500. That is terrible. Absolutely terrible. But those are the odds in this game. Those are just the odds. So you got to be able to go 500. But then at some point I realized, no, I can't keep speaking to 100 people. I got to speak to 5 people who actually are going to get it.
Do you know what? So I want us to come back to the quality of interaction, and I love how you've also set that up. But before we get to that, maybe like leaning into the question I asked about, traction points, what traction points do you, independent of what the market is saying, point to as a lead on your team, as the visionary lead of this concept and business that you're building? What stands out to you as that's truly traction for us, and that was an incredible inflection point for our business?
Look, I got into this space at a time when nobody really knew what was going on. We're sort of trying to build this company out of Zimbabwe, right? Had I, tried building this company out in Silicon Valley or, in another developed market, they could have gotten it much quicker. The first year was me educating people on the difference between blockchain and Bitcoin. Right. And it sucked. It was so terrible to be able to do that, because I had to educate people, before even the technology itself could be in their hands. They needed to know what it was. Right. And I had to go through that process for it to work. Then COVID came. And with COVID, what happened was there was a sudden need overnight for these processes that I was pitching about and trying to convince them to digitize. And, that is when I would say I had my first big break with the first client, the first financial institution, which then decided to be onboarded by us and actually pay us real money for that solution, right? So that was a massive game changer. But even then, they also wanted us to do it, in time with, in a specific amount of time and in phases, because the risk was just too high for them to be able to translate their systems. They've not fully transitioned up to now, right? Just to tell you how slow this point can be. But the third thing that also then occurred was, we built the technology despite what the naysayers were saying. This was a very sophisticated tech that had not been built on the continent before. I mean, for the most part in the world, very few companies working on this. And it was a little club of, startups that were getting money, from crypto VCs and funders in the West or in Asia. And, they had their own vision of this. I mean, I understood this problem from a first principles perspective. Other competitors were approaching this problem from a very technological perspective, right? Because they had the PhD engineers, they had the cryptographers, they had much better talent than we had to be able to do this. So, being able to build out the first prototypes that were actually stress tested by the first VCs who gave us funding, when they did their own technical due diligence, like, wow, this tech is actually real, it works. That was a critical inflection point, I would say, because that then allowed us to also be able to tap into the financial muscle of a third party, which allowed us to continue building. And I would say the fourth thing as well, which, was important, was just not giving up as well, right? Having quite a lot of grit, being able to survive through different periods. The end of 2022 was very tough because when the crypto market fell, all funding dried up. And 2023 was kind of this, no man's land kind of year where a lot of companies are shutting down. I mean, we also internally had to do a lot of rearrangements in terms of our personnel. I mean, there's a lot of things that were going on. The macro environment for our industry, that particular industry, was tough. It was a massive recession. And it also gave me time to kind of realign the values that I wanted, go back to first principles in terms of how to address some of the challenges around adoption we were facing, and also just to rearrange everything, right? From personnel to market product. So it's never one thing, but it's always, a number of things that happen, one after the other. And your responsibility is being able to make sure that the chain doesn't break at some point. If it breaks, it's all over, right? So you got to make sure the chain doesn't break and you just remain consistent, regardless of what the environment, micro or macro, looks like.
This is just a quick word about our presenting sponsor, the iFHP. Now, the iFHP facilitates knowledge sharing between health insurance leaders globally, helping drive innovation in healthcare delivery. Their network includes both established insurers and emerging market players working to expand access to quality healthcare. To learn more about their work and how you can be a part, visit ifhp.com.
Initiate those of us who aren't as familiar with, first principles thinking and how you applied it coming out of that really tough season.
First principles, the framework you got to be thinking about is what are the building blocks of the solution or problem you're trying to address, right? Like, what are the initial building blocks? I'm not talking about the high level, sophisticated things, right? It's the building blocks, right? Like, if you want to sell, water to somebody, bottled water, okay, what are the first principles of that business? You got to find a natural spring to be able to extract the water from, right? You got to be able to do that in a manner that doesn't contaminate your source. And then you got to be able to have a process of bottling it up. And then you got to have a process of then being able to distribute that. Right? If you can't even dig a borehole, you can never get into the business of, extracting water from the ground and selling it. It just can't happen, right? So first principles thinking is, before we even start marketing our product, how do we even build it? Unfortunately for tech companies, people often started like the last stage, which is writing the code for the app and then hoping miraculously 1 million people start using it. It doesn't work like that. In Africa, you have to be thinking about who is going to use your product. Do they even have the ability to download your app? So we know the graveyard of failed African tech startups is an international monument. Many of which have raised millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars in funding, and they failed because the first principles thinking was just not there. To say, we want to do e-commerce, but do we have the delivery infrastructure? Can you actually deliver mail from one part of your country to the other part and it arrives?
Or your town.
And it arrives on the same day? If you can't deliver a piece of paper, what makes you think you're going to be able to deliver food? What makes you think you're going to be able to deliver medication? What makes you think you're going to be able to deliver a parcel, right? So first principles thinking, let's build out the infrastructure which is going to allow us to have this thing. And for me, it was realizing that one of the hindrances to adoption that we are having was just basic internet access, right? The kind of partners we wanted, like, for example, clinics or educational institutions or branches of financial institutions who are operating in rural areas or semi-rural areas, they just didn't have internet access. And that kills a massive market that we're trying to address, because now we had to come up with all sorts of innovations to address that, trying to build low internet solutions like, let's use WhatsApp chatbots, let's use USSD. And by doing that, we were butchering the functionality and features that people were supposed to use. So I had to go back to the drawing board and say, look, before this thing can actually scale, this is not going to be a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year project. This is going to take 10 to 15 years. right? And I need to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, I'm going to solve problem 1, right? I got to drill a borehole. Right. Then I'm after solving problem 1, I got to put a pipe somewhere, and then I got to take the water. And then after that, I got to put the water in a bottle. After that, I got to put a label. After that, I then got to find a way to sell it. The selling part is going to become easy. The hard part is being able to ensure that the back end of the business, the building blocks of the business, they're stable, they're functional, and they're solid. So that is, first principles thinking, right? That's how I'd phrase it.
First principles a la Africa, in the sense that this might look very, very different in more developed markets. It really does sound like first principles thinking on the continent in many instances requires you to basically not just be the entrepreneur, the founder, but also be the plumber, the engineer, planner, the politician in some cases, to lobby for certain policy shifts or, infrastructural or resource allocation at like a massive government level. Back to the question of quality interaction that you've pointed at. I think that this is an opportune time for you to sort of share now, like the kind of credentials you've had to systematically acquire in order to put you in a position to basically explore a first principles approach, because I can tell you now for free, or at least our audience, in practice, that it's not for everybody. And you would have had to acquire a certain level of connectivity, relationships, network access, and of course, reputational equity to be able to leverage, to leverage that into growth and scaling. So talk us through what that looks like for a young Mutare-born Zimbabwean, trying to build this startup.
Yeah, I mean, first thing is I'm anti-credentialism.
I know, and this is also why I'm really intentional. You don't lead with it. You don't be like, hey, I won this award or that, or I have a WIF affiliation or whatnot. But I do think it speaks to, in a really awkward way, the unfortunate realities of our world.
Yeah, I mean, which is true. I mean, I'll start by saying this. The reason I'm anti-credentialism is that for the most part, it paints a picture which is often untrue, and it limits your scope of vision as to what can be, right? And I speak from experience because, again, coming from a small town in Zimbabwe, I had an opportunity, when I was still in my high school year, to leave the country and go to the US and attend, some very prestigious institutions. And I mean, I had agency, meaning that I looked for those opportunities. I mean, that's one of the first things I would say, that opportunities do not materialize from thin air. People often like to say that you got to be very lucky. And I would say luck requires a lot of agency, meaning that you got to put yourself in positions where you can get lucky. You just don't wake up one morning and people are knocking at your door and say, hey, you've gotten a scholarship to go to this, to go to Harvard or to go to MIT. You actually got to apply. And then you also got to be able to feel, to know what requirements are needed and then be able to fulfill those requirements. And then that puts you in another stage where if you have more agency, again, and you apply yourself, and something else is going to happen, and so on and so on. It's a weird kind of anthropological equation that is very difficult to put in words, but in practice, I think this is probably why theater in media is good, because it's much better articulated visually. Right? When you watch a movie about, let's say, Steve Jobs or Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg, right? When you watch the faces visually, you kind of get it. If you were to ask Zuckerberg, how did you become the world's youngest billionaire? I don't think he has an answer. I would be surprised if he gives you an answer.
Or a playbook that you can emulate.
It's very hard. But what happens is your reputation grows with the agency that you have, right? So you go from this institution or this phase in your life, you accomplish A, B, C, D, and it does that. With FlexID, one of the key things that happened was, we then got nominated, to become, the first company from Zimbabwe to ever be inducted into the World Economic Forum's Tech Pioneers. So it's 100 companies that are selected every year. And, we're the very first company from Zim to be selected. And I'll tell you, we didn't even fit the baseline criteria at the time, which was you needed to have raised about $5 million. right? We hadn't even raised anywhere close to that amount of money. And you needed to be at a certain level of growth. But for some reason, again, which I know I can't really tell you what it was, the adjudicators thought that we actually did fit the criteria based on what the solution had the potential to accomplish. And also, perhaps how I managed to communicate the story to them and how I managed to, be able to be in a position where I'm saying, look, I'm building this company and I do believe it's a worthy candidate for, sort of this kind of environment. So that obviously then brought a lot more credentials associated with it in terms of validation, etc. And like I said earlier on, you can't do it by yourself. At different stages, you are going to need different people to also give you validation, right? Customers give you validation. Do you have someone who's paying for your product? Yeah. Investors give you validation. Is there someone willing to risk financial capital on you, right? That's good. Institutions like, just whether they're giving you award, whether it's a podcast, someone actually giving you the platform to say, narrate your story, right? Because you don't go around picking random people to be on your podcast, right? You kind of select them. So even if the role is not financial or material, it's still very important. There's so many blogs and online platforms that gave us an opportunity to say our story. And all those guys, they played an instrumental role. So they built out the credentials such that if you were to Google me or Google the company, you could find us, right? And it wasn't just like some random thing someone was talking about. So there is a plethora of different sectors, right? From media to finance to just general people who rallied behind the vision and said, we believe this can be something. And that social credit score, I would say, is far more valuable because even if it fails, even if the company doesn't go anywhere, you have built a solid foundation for being able to do something next because people know you, they know what you've done, they know your competence, they know you can do it.
They trust you.
They trust you, And again, failure, and I would say perhaps, one of the points I put out, failure is very, very necessary. And I would say it's acceptable. And the first person who must accept failure is also yourself, right? Because founders believe you. And it's a good thing. You got to believe you got to make it regardless of what. But the reality on the ground is you're going to realize the idea you originally had is terrible. You're going to change things. The technology you thought was going to, solve the problem is terrible. You got to change it. The investors you thought were going to help you sometimes might pull out and say, look, we're not giving you more capital. Figure it out. And, that might be disappointing. The market might not take your product. You might think you've built the best product and the market says, no, we don't think this is it. And you got to go back to the drawing board. So as a founder, it's also important to realize part of the credentials that people are going to take seriously from you is your ability to say, look, guys, this didn't work, right? And it didn't work because of these reasons. And I'm going to do this to solve it. You got to be honest. Right, you gotta be honest and transparent. If you try to be a superhero, like you're Iron Man or something, and that nothing ever fails, you're gonna lose a lot of credibility because there's no way on earth that is possible.
Leverageable goodwill and trust is how I distill it. You've actually validated a framework that's emerging that I'm sort of propagating. Skills, expertise, resources, connectivity. Skills. Listening to you, and I'm going to recite this. So if I get this wrong or I miss something, let me know. So on the skill side, it seems that you had this privileged opportunity to be born in a place that would create a baseline opportunity for you to acquire enough skills to acquire further skills at some of the best educational institutions in the world that come not just with the advantage of the quality of the skill you get there, but also with the prestige that accompanies attending those institutions. Skills, correct so far?
Correct. To an extent, yeah.
What's the oversimplification there?
Look, in the end, serendipity does play a part.
Okay, so then we're going to come to that in a moment. Okay, so if serendipity, what I call providence, let's account for that separately. So if that's skills, and I'm oversimplifying to get us to the landing point of our conversation, but I want you to also stress test what I'm thinking. So then, through the lens of experience, through the rinser that is experience, skill is then translates to expertise in my view, right? Whether or not how you acquire that that experience is now irrelevant whether you're paid for it or not. And I know how unfair that is. Some places pay interns, others don't. Or, sometimes you learned under the tutelage of someone who put you under their wing or whatnot, or you went to a much more hands-on institution than others, or you through experience, skill translates to expertise. That expertise, in my view, is an entrepreneurial skill set that is applied within the context of being a founder in startups, which is a unique type of entrepreneurship. So I would say you're an expert founder, as it were, accounting for the fact that failure is part of the equation. So far?
I mean, sure. What I believe is you only become an expert through practicing, right? So if you graduate from med school today, and you show people your degree and your credentials, and then someone appears and then they say, I've been, operating people for 20 years, right? You might have been the highest, valedictorian, you smashed or examined.
Golden key.
But people are going to lean towards the experience. And you cannot gain experience without being a practitioner. Same with flying a plane, right? You need the hours. The hours are what give you credibility. You know exactly what to do in certain emergencies and situations. You don't panic. You're able to actually then have leadership skills, right? So unfortunately, if you're going to start a company for the very first time, you're going to have to go through this process. There is no silver bullet. There is only a minuscule number of examples. And really in those examples where you had a first-time founder completely smash it out on the first hit, they were able to build a team of hundreds of years of combined experience. And like I said, the founders are not really the heroes. You see the face, but you do not see the talent and expertise and skills that were brought together and were able to do it. So that is, I would say, my conclusion to sort of that.
Yeah. So then still, I feel like you're validating it loosely, and I'm going to sit with this later. So I know you don't want to sit with it, but I do think in your own little universe, you are above average maturing as in your expertise within the context of building startups. I do think the further validation leans into, wait, has he built a startup or a business or businesses that are validated by the market, right? In other words, have you built things that the market has now said, actually, not only are you great at that, we are so great at it, we're willing to throw money at it, So, and I think what's interesting about you too is that you've had a taste of what that is like in humbling ways that, it strikes me as limited traction, but also sufficient traction to warrant, even more effort to try and gain more traction. And so to me, that's where the resource base comes into play, whether that resource base is, again, this experiential base or a building Rolodex of people who trust you, VCs that are willing to back you, etc. And so again, skills, expertise, resources. So far, what do you think?
Yeah. I mean, that's a good combination of things. Obviously, when it comes to getting validation for your expertise by market adoption, right? It is a double-edged sword, I would say. It's a double-edged sword. And the reason it's a double-edged sword is in some scenarios, you can get adoption and validation, but without necessarily having figured out the process, right? Like I said, there's an aspect of serendipity which comes into play. VC is a very tight knit community where only a few people really understand how it works. And more importantly, a few people get funding, right? So you find funding typically goes to second, third time founders, sometimes like fourth time founders, right? It's people who've been in the game, who've been able to build the networks, connections, who are able to, narrate their story. And, they were part and parcel of some of the companies. Silicon Valley is a good example of it. You can't really come from the outside to break into Silicon Valley. Usually you got to be a part of it from inception, right? Either you worked at Google, Facebook, one of these big companies, and, you then had the connection.
PayPal, obviously.
PayPal, you're part of the PayPal mafia. And it's much, much easier for you to then be able to sort of propagate out of it and be able to build something, be able to get funding, be able to get, to build a team compared to someone who's coming from like rural Arizona, and they know absolutely nothing about this game. It's kind of similar to politics too, right? Like there are very few examples in the world where in a democratic system, an independent candidate ever won an election. Never happens. We know that regardless of how bad a candidate is, so long as they are part of a known institution, a known party, they will get votes. Right. So, there are very few exceptions in human history where someone came from absolutely the outside and they bamboozled the system. Usually you got to be part of a two-party system. That's how it works. So, in startups, it's kind of similar, right? You need to know your tribe, which you are attached to, and that starts early. You got to build a community. When I started out, I had other founders who were on this journey with me. There are numerous other founders in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, who were on this journey. Some are still running their startups now. Some are onto new things. Some have now been absorbed by, larger institutions. Some are part of corporate. Some are now doing VC. There's a lot of people I started on this journey with who had nothing as well, who had a dream, had a vision, and things turned out very differently for all of us. And that's my tribe. Most of those people up to now, if I post something, whether it's a thread or it's a Twitter post or it's an idea or it's a new product or service I'm building, they're often the first people who start pushing it out to their own networks, right? Because it is something they identify with, even though they're getting no financial benefit whatsoever. That's typically how, that this industry works. Yeah.
So then you've closed the loop for me beautifully now. So if we've got skills, by the way, he's not prepped on this at all. He hasn't read any of my musings on this, but skills, expertise, resources, connectivity, in my view. And again, if connectivity is broken down to, in my thinking, as relationships, network access, and reputational equity, I would say it's probably one of the under-invested or poorly invested areas of entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial people who are driving entrepreneurial or intrapreneurial effort. I think what you've just described, even in the telling of your story, which is really well documented, and there'll be links to some of it in the show notes, etc. It will be really interesting for people to reflect on the conversation we've had for themselves, without us trying to, share this as some kind of playbook. If you did this, then you can sort of emulate your success. But if you were to reflect on some of what you're hearing in this conversation, and also reflect on the track record of credentializing and credential sort of acquiring, as well as pragmatic achievement, you might do well to reflect on how you are grooming your connectivity to aid all of the three. How to grow your skill base and how to improve that, and which area in your expertise you might be weak at and need to sort of grow in and gain experience to validate. And similarly, what experience you might need to translate into resources to drive your entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship. And so I share all of this just because when I heard you speak at a conference recently, you literally, this was running in my mind as I was recognizing in practice things that I'm only starting to distill for myself, but it's clearly something you've been living for a very, very long time. And so with that as a, and this is as we sort of land the plane, as a springboard for explaining how it is you are now a second time founder for an idea that doesn't seem to have immediate, connection with your first idea, which is still live. What's the big idea? You mentioned it as Shona. What do you want people to know about how you're applying yourself to this new thing?
Yeah. So, it goes back to the issue of first principles. One of the key things I realized in building, tech startups, right? There've been others that, are in the background or, that we tried. Some failed, some didn't go anywhere. Some, actually, reached some kind of financial success, but they couldn't scale. The underlying challenge was always we're operating in a market where the target, consumer struggled with connectivity. And that, resulted in us having to always strip away the beauty and sophistication of the solution in order to match that reality. And unfortunately, what that would mean is that the product would get so bastardized that it wouldn't end up really solving the problem, right? it became hypocritical in a sense, because what you were really preaching and what you ended up giving people was completely different, because you were trying to match their standard, and their standard was internet was just not available. So, last year I decided to kind of think about how I could solve that problem using new information and new technology, which was now in the market. So I'm sure most people know about Starlink, which is, a subsidiary of SpaceX, Elon Musk's company. And at the time it started to propagate across Africa. And it's a very simple device. It takes about 15 minutes to set up, and you can take it anywhere, geographic area. You can take it to a village, and you have comparable high-speed internet to someone who's on fiber in a first world country. Now, I don't think most people realize the significance of what that means. If you are able to give a person in a rural area more than 200, 300 megabits per second of speed of internet access, they are able to accomplish any other task that they would if they were sitting in New York City or in Dubai. Right? That is absolutely revolutionary. And you're doing this for under $500. Again, very revolutionary. So I decided that, no, I need to jump on this thing, but more importantly, I need to bake it into a product that people can acquire, and a product that can scale, and a product that can be useful. So I decided to incorporate Shona Prince Technologies, which is an authorized distributor of Starlink in Southern Africa. And we initially rolled out this operation in Mozambique, in Maputo, which became the testing ground and continues to be our initial market for rolling out most of our new products and features. And for the longest time, I stopped talking about it now. We've been in stealth mode. We've been in stealth mode for over 6-7 months. We even did a pre-seed round, which we failed and managed to raise capital. And again, no announcements, no articles. Why? Because
Connectivity.
Yeah, I also realized that from a founder perspective, I also really wanted to focus on building this out without the distractions. I think founders, we get distracted a lot, right? We get distracted by, being caught up in founder mode, as some people would say, or in CEO mode. And, you kind of end up forgetting or not putting as much attention into the thing that actually is of value. So it's one of the things that rephrased my mind, and I said, no, I'm just going to build this thing out until we actually get to a point where it's worthwhile talking about, right? And I still don't talk about it. There's one of the only few platforms I'll
Yes.
Yeah, I'll mention it. And
thank you, man.
Yeah. And, we are propagating, the creation of, Wi-Fi hotspots. We've created our own, software, and we have our own hardware that rides, with the whole ecosystem, right? To be able to monetize on bandwidth and be able to offer, services. So, that's what I can say for now in regards to that. But
you should have been at iFHP's Big Ideas workshop to hear more, because you were sharing a lot more than that with the people in the room who actually really like the kind of partners you hope to have to make more of. You had obviously many of Africa's largest health payers, many of them own hospital groups or pharmacy chains and things of that nature, the kind of sweet spot partner for this kind of rollout, yeah?
Correct. It wasn't a wonderful event. The quality of people and interactions and conversations.
Back to the quality thing again.
Yeah. It's, you need to know where to put your attention, where to put value, where to put time, where to put resources. It becomes more important. A first-time founder, when I was a first-time founder, I made a lot of mistakes, right? In terms of where I was putting my time.
You'd have been at the biggest conference with 15,000 people.
Exactly. And none of those people know you. They really don't care. They are more interested in the guy with a valuation for $1 billion, They're interested in the big VCs. They're interested in the hubris of the moment, in the hubris of the whole industry. You don't gain much value, right? But I will say, look, if it's your first time, do it, because you need the experience, but you need to learn. The most important things is learn from all those experiences that, okay, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. Once you've learned, it becomes much more material in terms of what you then get to do next. So some mistakes are expensive, but don't worry too much about them. Rather focus on the teachings that are going to come and apply them. If you don't apply them, then, you're kind of a fool. What you want to do is to apply those learnings as much as possible. And, you're going to have an interesting journey that you can hopefully talk about someday.
Victor, this could go on, but it can't.
Yeah, I mean, it could go on forever.
I'm really enjoying this conversation, and I really feel privileged and grateful to you for sharing your story. You're obviously in a lot of important meetings where a lot of speaking is done, and it's been a really long day for you. And I appreciate your generosity to the village. The village thanks you. The village is listening. And yeah, wish you absolutely nothing but the best for both these startups that you're building. And more to the point, I just hope enough would-be entrepreneurs and intrapreneurs who can borrow some of these ideas are listening and are humble to some of the things you've shared here today, and not hero worship you as much as appropriately acknowledge the nuanced experience of the African tech entrepreneur in a way that's both aspirational but also suitably sober to the reality of what it means to build on the continent for global impact. So again, thank you so much for being on the podcast, man.
No, thank you for having me here. And I mean, to the listeners, thank you for listening. Definitely subscribe and share, and encourage, other entrepreneurs, to get in touch with our wonderful host here, because he is doing an amazing job of highlighting some of the changes going on the continent. And we would not be able to do this without you and people like yourself. So, I mean, keep doing what you're doing. It's definitely a foundational building block for us as well.
Fist bump. They can't see it. Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Cheers, man. Cheers.